Bonsoir tout le monde. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nyya Flores Toussaint. I'm a 2019 graduate of Union Theological Seminary, and I am your host for this evening. Tonight's conversation first and foremost honors the Gede, as November in the Haitian Voodoo tradition is Fèt Gede. Fèt Gede honors the Lua, who are the spirits of death. Mama Lola, a Voodoo priestess who once lived in Brooklyn, once described Papa Gede as a cemetery man. She reminded us that though Papa Gede lives in the cemetery, it does not mean he's a bad man. She said he's a very good man. He loves children a lot. He loves women a lot. He loves everybody. He loves to help people. And when people are sick, all of this sickness, it's his job to help. Papa Gede helped Mama Lola heal many people during her life. The Gede's proximity to healing, death, and laughter remind us in this season the ways we must find balance between joy and death, tricks and sickness. Karen McCarthy Brown called balancing Gede's art form. It is my prayer that in this time of disease, loss, death, we may look to the Gede for balance while we continue in health, providence, and life. We invite the Gede into this place that we may trick our political, social, economic, medical, and spiritual dilemmas from being life or death to being situations where we confidently embrace life and death. For Toussaint, which is today, All Saints Day, and for Dia de los Muertos, for Fèt Gede, we utilize the breath within us to honor those souls who now move without breath. And thus we welcome you to the Character Assassination of Haiti, a conversation with Dr. Natalie Frédéric Pierre, Dr. Mamaira Duje Prosper, and Dr. Kyra Malika Daniels. This conversation is personal to all Haitians. We are a people who have been teased as children for coming from Hades. We are a people who have fallen victim to the vicious lies that inspire missionaries to fill planes wearing t-shirts claiming that God told them to save us, even though they are petrified of us. We are a people who have been told by the exploitative empires that embargoes, indemnities, and stolen reserves and humanitarian theft is what we deserve for having the audacity to believe that we could be free and sovereign Black people. Because of our audacity to hope and our success in manifesting that hope, we are the people said to be in bed with Satan himself. While the United States has assassinated the character of God, while the United States has assassinated the character of the God it claims has divinely blessed it, it has also assassinated Haiti and its people by creating a false truth that Haiti is cursed by God. Tonight is the night that we put the United States on trial for its offenses against Haiti. I'm thankful to our sponsors, Union Theological Seminary, the Haitian Studies Association, and Incultured Company. I'm eternally grateful to Dr. Samuel Cruz, Associate Professor of Religion and Society here at Union Theological Seminary, for moderating this conversation. I am also thankful for him for his support as a Black Puerto Rican and possibly a Black Puerto Rican of Haitian descent, but we're still figuring that out, for his support of the Haitian people. If you do not know, Dr. Cruz is currently hosting a fundraiser for our partners in Haiti. There will be a link in the chat if you would like to donate. Our goal is to raise $5,000 tonight, at least, from Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, and other allies to support folks who have been devastated by the recent earthquakes and different natural disasters. These are grassroots organizers, I should say. And so we trust that this money will be used in the ways that the Haitian people desire for it to be used. And we will also, you will hear more about the fundraising efforts throughout the night, but at this time, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Cruz for some opening remarks. And so let me introduce Dr. Cruz to you for those who may not know who he is. Reverend Dr. Samuel Cruz is an associate professor of religion and society at Union Theological Seminary and pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. Over the last 15 years, Dr. Cruz has been conducting ethnographic research on urban and Caribbean Latinx religion, focusing predominantly on Pentecostalism and African-based Caribbean or Latinx religions, as well as comparative analyses of Latinx religion and Euro-American religious traditions. Thank you, Dr. Cruz.
Welcome to everybody, and thank you, Nyya, for hosting and moderating this panel with me this evening. I'm extremely excited to be a part of this panel. It's like a dream come true because for years I have noticed and witnessed how our beautiful Haitian sisters and brothers have been maligned and their great religious tradition of Voodoo. And as to begin this panel this evening, I was thinking that I was reflecting upon the fact that there's a lot of discussion of cancel culture in our society here in the United States. And really what it is that right-wing ideologues, especially white men, are upset because their ideas about what our society should look like and be like is being, according to them, canceled out. And what's really happening is that other voices are coming to the forefront. I also seen so-called white liberal men and women talk about cancel culture because I feel that perhaps they're losing their power in the society thanks to a lot of young people who are pushing back. And I was thinking that the United States, the reality is that the United States and Europe have been canceling cultures for centuries with their imperialist hegemonic ideas. They have continuously tried to cancel the Haitian people and its culture and its religion, Voodoo. You know, in fact, Christianity is perhaps the biggest canceling of religion culture in the world. So I am excited that tonight we're going to push back on US imperialism and its hegemonic ideas, which try to cancel out all other cultures of our world. And in this case, we're discussing the Haitian people and its nation, its culture, and its religion, Voodoo. So I'm excited to have these great scholars here with us tonight to try to deconstruct all those false ideas that have been trying to cancel out the Haitian people. So I welcome them this evening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cruz. So at this time, I would like to spend some time introducing our speakers. So we have Dr. Kyra Malika Daniels, who is an assistant professor of art history and African diaspora. Sorry, I got it. African and African diaspora studies with a courtesy appointment in theology. Her research interest and course topics include Africana religions, sacred arts, and material culture, race, religion, and visual culture and ritual healing traditions in the Black Atlantic. Her first book, Art of the Healing Gods in Progress, is a comparative religion project that examines key ritual art objects used in healing ceremonies to treat spiritual illnesses and mental health conditions in Haiti, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Daniels was awarded a Getty ACLS postdoctoral fellowship in the history of art for 2019 to 2020, and is currently on leave for fall 2020 to finish her book manuscript. well, I hope she's back, but I think she's back in class now because she's been telling us about how wonderful her classes have been. But we hope her manuscript went well. And then Dr. Mamayura Duje Prosper is an assistant professor at University of California, Irvine in the Global and International Studies department, specializing in research on social movements in the Caribbean and Latin America, particularly Black and Haitian social movements. Prosper serves as the international coordinator for the Pan-African Solidarity Network and community movement builders, with community movement builders in the US. In that capacity, she serves as the coordinator for the Leve Campe avec Haiti International Coalition that includes organizations in Canada, the US, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, working to amplify the struggles of the people of Haiti. Dr. Nathalie Frédérique Pierre is a historian of the African diaspora. She researches Black political thought during the 19th century. Her dissertation examines the creolization of Western political thought in Haiti after its revolutionary independence. She earned her doctorate in history from NYU, has a BA in history and English from Howard University, and graduated from the public schools in Brooklyn, New York. In addition to her scholarship, Dr. Pierre served as a chairwoman of the Flamboyant Haitian Literacy Project, an immigrant education advocacy organization that partners with migrant Haitian teens who need support navigating New York City public schools. She is now an assistant professor at Howard University. And so thank you all for being here. And before we jump into our conversation, we would like to show everyone who's with us what we are talking about and how Haiti's character has been assassinated. So we're going to show a clip, a short clip. And if you would like to, begin to chat in the chats, we welcome you to use the chat features at this time. Please pose any questions that you have for the speakers. We will have a short time of Q&A at the end. And so we'll be able to field some of those questions to our speakers. But we welcome you and we say thank you for being here. So at this time, you will hear a short clip. You will see and hear a short clip, and then we will jump right into our conversation.
The Protestant evangelical understanding is that the spirits of voodoo are demons. Then their authority comes from Satan. There is good and there is evil. There is right and there is wrong. And they emanate from the spiritual entities that are God and Satan. Satan wants to kill, steal, and destroy humans.
And you think that voodoo has allowed Satan in to take hold of this nation?
Haiti's a little unique in that the nation was given to Satan. It's kind of the opposite what happened with the American slaves. The American slaves somehow got the religion of the slave masters, but they got it right. So what they were doing, meeting in secret and stuff like that, singing and praying and worshiping the Lord and calling upon Him, when their release came, it was a blessing.
But that wasn't the case with
Haiti. They turned to the Loa and said, basically, we give our nation to you if you will deliver us from the French.
Is that what victory in this spiritual battle for the soul of Haiti looks like?
That's how it starts. It can't start any other way. And so...
How does it end?
It ends with the economy of a nation going up, with things that people thought could never happen, happening. God's waiting for the unity, repentance, humility, love of the Christians in this nation to invite Him to come and take over. Prends tout Haïti, bon Dieu. Prends tout Haïti, Jésus. Prends tout Haïti, Saint-Esprit, pour nous qu'aweyu rêver avec une transformation tout pays en net.
Pat, this is a calamity of cataclysmic proportions. I'm sure it's the worst thing that's happened since the tsunami, and it's just it's a mess, Pat.
Well, if all those buildings are down, I understand more are fallen than are standing. It may be a blessing in disguise. There might be a massive rebuilding of that country. Is that possible?
Well, I don't know. I would think that that would be a pretty optimistic attitude.
Christy, something happened a long time ago in Haiti, and people might not want to talk about it. They were under the heel of the French, you know, Napoleon III and whatever. And they got together and swore a pact to the devil. They said, we will serve you if you'll get us free from the French. It's a true story. And so the devil said, okay, it's a deal. And they kicked the French out. You know, the Haitians revolted and got themselves free. But ever since, they have been cursed by one thing after the other, desperately poor. That island of Hispaniola is one island. It's cut down the middle. On the one side is Haiti, on the other side is the Dominican Republic. Dominican Republic is prosperous, healthy, full of resorts, etc. Haiti is in desperate poverty. Same island. They need to have, and we need to pray for them, a great turning to God. And out of this tragedy, I'm optimistic something good may come.
So I know that is a lot for folks, but I am going to let us dive right in. I'm going to welcome up our speakers, Dr. Pierre, Dr. Daniels, Dr. Duje Prosper, and I turn it over to you, Dr. Cruz.
Well, my first question is for all the panelists. After watching those disgusting videos, in your respective domains of history, international studies, anthropology, religion, and Black studies, what is the significance of the Bwa Kayiman ceremony, and how is it contextualized in your fields of study? Dr. Daniels, if you like to go first.
Sure. Allow me to first dire tout le monde bonsoir and to thank you for the gracious invitation. This is really a dream panel for me to be engaged with two of my beloved sister colleagues. So I want to thank you for the invitation. I also want to note that I'm joining everyone this evening from Watertown, Massachusetts. This is the original land, and the original stewards of this land are Nonantum peoples and Massachusetts peoples. We give honor to their colonial experiences of history and their contemporary realities. And because n'a toujours fêté loyaux, I have a little babancourt that we are going to drop for les ancêtres, parce que nous pas qu'à faire aucun bail sans yo. Donc nous dit tout loyaux merci, nous dit bonsoir tout loyaux, tout mystérieux, merci en pile pour toute bénédiction par nous la vie nous. Continuez par nous lumière pour continuer avec chemin là, pour continuer avec lutte là. Aïe bobo. Bwa Kayiman. There's so much to say, and I'm really eager to hear my fellow colleagues, Dr. Duje Prosper and Dr. Piel, share their insights, because in the field of religion where I'm trained, this is considered to be a spiritual birthplace, if you will, of the founding republic that would come to be known as Haiti. So August 14th, 1791, an assembly was formed. Maroon peoples who had formerly been enslaved, but who conducted autonomous societies in the colony of Saint-Domingue, gathered together along with some freed people of colors to plan, conspire, and to envision a new future, to envision what might be possible if liberty was obtained through force. And the understanding in a religious studies field is that a ceremony took place. What I find to be so fascinating is that usually the term that is used here is a Vodou ceremony was conducted. But in fact, it's more complicated than this, because we know that two of the political leaders and perhaps also religious leaders of this gathering were Dati Boukman and Cécile Fatima. Dati Boukman had come from the island now known as Jamaica, and he was possibly called Boukman because he may have been a Muslim, man of the book, Boukman, which means, which makes a great deal of sense because in fact, many of the uprisings of enslaved peoples in the African diaspora were led by Muslims. This is the case in Brazil in the 1500s. This is the case in Jamaica. This is the case in the United States. So it's quite possible that Dati Boukman himself was a Muslim adherent, or that he may have been raised Muslim. Cécile Fatima, we can identify her name as sounding quite similar to Fatima, or another Muslim name. What is interesting is that she is identified as a quote unquote Creole woman, woman of mixed heritage, of mixed lineage, who is identified as a Mambo, as a Vodou priestess. And as the story goes in the more sordid version, a pact was made with the devil, animal sacrifice took place. In a more respectful, and I would argue a more likely case, a mystic pact was made with the Roi. A mystic pact was made with the spirits. That was a continuation of the solidarity that had already begun, that had already been established between maroon peoples, enslaved peoples, and peoples who were free to create a new nation, to fight for one's freedom. And I think there are scholars who identify this, such as Lois Wilkin, as really a confederation of peoples. I think that this language is quite helpful, and I'm going to turn to my fellow colleagues for their own contextualizing, but this is the way that it is framed. And I'll just end by saying, you know, when recognizing that a ceremony is done for a community, it's important to recognize that offerings are made to the spirits for guidance, for protection, for force, for courage. What happens in a mystic pact with the spirits is that an exchange takes place in which offerings are made so that blessings can be received. And in this instance, in the field of religion, we understand this to be a pact, a mystic sort of contractual exchange with the Roi to ensure that Haiti could envision itself anew.
Dr. Prosper, would you like to?
I think I would cede to Dr. Pierre. I think she's going to give us some of the historical context of the Bwa Kayiman that I hope to connect to the 2010 earthquake and present.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dr. Doja Prosper. Good evening, everyone. Dr. Daniels, thank you for that launch straight into the question of Islam in the Haitian Revolution. So this idea that Bwa Kayiman is a pact with the devil, perhaps according to epistemologies that support white supremacy, they can have that. But when we're looking at the African people who arrived to the Americas, these people were terrified captives. They did not speak the same languages, but they had similar epistemologies anchored in their African past. So to this point that Dr. Daniels brings up about Cécile Fatima and Boukman Dati most likely being Muslim or the children of Muslim Africans, we need to think about this ceremony in ways that will help us understand the connection between religion and politics across the African diaspora. And forgive me, I use the word religion and spirituality interchangeably. Dr. Daniels and I talk about this all the time, but for me as a historian, they're interchangeable in many ways. So let's talk about this. So you have two Africans who obviously have networks in their community in order to call people on a work night to come meet to talk about something. So Cécile Fatima and Boukman Dati are both respected leaders, whether that is a spiritual leader, whether that is a political leader. They have that sort of clout to generate the audience necessary. So we also need to remember that the majority of Haitians were born in Africa. So they're coming to this meeting. They're not necessarily speaking the same languages, but they have a similar spiritual cosmology that is anchoring them. Now, if we take this thesis that Fatima and Boukma are Muslim, let's think about this pig pact for a second. We understand that in the Islamic philosophy, there's something unpure about a pig. So to have these perhaps Muslim Africans using a pig to seal their political oath, that just demonstrates how far they were willing to go for their eventual goal, which was liberation. Another point that I want to bring up about the possible Islamic connection of these two figures is that 1791, I did some research over the summer. Ramadan falls about 2 months before the launch of the Haitian Revolution. So when we seriously interrogate the possible Islamic backgrounds of these people, we can begin to have a generative conversation about what African Muslims have contributed to the Americas. And the final point I want to make in this brief opening is Bwa Kayiman, as Dr. Daniels mentioned, the work of Lois Wilkin, Confederation, Congress, Bwa Kayiman Congress is another term that scholars are recently embracing in order to take it out of the conversation of the stigmatized mystical conversation. We want to put clearer political labels on it so that we can look at the Bwa Kayiman Congress in conversation with movements that begin in religious spaces, like the civil rights movement. So religious spiritual spaces are one of the few sites of autonomy that people of African descent have always had in our 500-year experience in the Americas. And when we begin to look at the sacrifices that these maybe Muslim people made, we begin to think about all African spirituality, all African religions in a political mobilization context. So I'll stop there and I'll stop there.
Dr. Pierre? Oh, no.
Yes. So first of all, this is a great conversation, and I can go in so many different directions, but I wanted to thank both Dr. Daniels and Dr. Pierre for their opening remarks, and just piggyback on this question about Bwa Kayiman. That's obviously right, whether we're thinking about it as a political or a spiritual event, is definitely a foundational myth, right, of the Haitian nation state. And this is precisely why we see in this video that it's important to attack, right, this moment. And so even though there's a lot of, debate about whether this Congress even happened, that, a lot of, I would say, white US historians, like to question, the evangelicals are clearly convinced that this did happen, right? And they take it very seriously. And so do Haitian people for the most part, right? That this is a foundational event for us in our identities. And so you see that there's an attack against this foundational myth. And it is threatening in particular for a couple of reasons that comes out in the sermons that we hear in the churches. Both we're hearing them, from the white evangelicals themselves, but also from Haitian diasporic pastors in Miami and Boston, and certainly Haitian pastors in Haiti. It's particularly threatening because it centers around, right, a woman, Cécile Fatima. And this not only destabilizes, right, this white supremacist trope, right, but it's also destabilizing the gendered heteronormative logic upon which white supremacy sits, right? We're talking about a woman, as far as they know, right, is single, or if she's not single, she's unattached to a man at the moment, right? She's wielding a lot of power. And according to how they understand what's happening in the ceremony, she's leveraging her sexuality to seduce men, primarily men, but we also assume some women, to, right, make a pact with the devil and to commit genocide, which is understood as a white genocide, right? So this anti-woman, anti-LGBT, anti-Voodoo narrative colors those sermons inside the church, right? So unlike the Catholics who sort of skirt around the issue in the sermons, particularly if we're thinking about post-1980s, the evangelicals are going straight to the heart of the matter. They're attacking the laws inside the church. And there's a connection being made with the figure, the biblical figure of Jezebel, right? Saying that Cecile Fatima is a reincarnation of Jezebel, right? And everything that Jezebel, the figure of Jezebel holds, right? A woman using her sexuality to seduce men into evil actions, right? So what we're seeing is that this trend, right, with these very violent, because what's happening is not only an attack against the law, but it's a calling of using fire and machetes against the laws to cut them down, to burn them, right? So there's a direct invocation of violence, and we see this trend particularly growing out of this 2010 moment, which the video, contextualizes for us a bit. And this is particularly important to think about why 2010, right? And a lot of us who are, critical scholars looking at contemporary Haitian history see in the 2004 moment and intensify in 2010 a recolonization of Haiti, and that it happens also with an intensification of the NGOs. And so in 2010, we're talking about an influx of, some people say up to 10,000 NGOs in Haiti, and many of them are Christian missions, right? Who are benefiting from all this money that was given essentially by folks who wanted the reconstruction of Haiti. And we could debate that. It's another conversation, right? But that's significant that they're coming in as NGOs, right? Nonprofit organizations. And they have a certain conceptualization of the family that they come also, right? So what does it mean to have specific kinds of Christians who have an idea of what the family is, and Haitian families, as most of us may know, right? They say over 47% of households are led by single women, right? Do not fit the idea of what family, a Christian heteronormative family should be. They're multi-generational. They're often led by women. And you would see that even in the distribution of foods in the camps, they were privileging men who may not even be related to these women and their families as brokers, right? To say, this is who gets to decide who gets what food. And in that process also, denying people who were visibly expressing, right, non-normative genders, food and shelter. And this is the beginning of this sort of more political organizing that LGBT, which is, called Community M as well, which I'll talk a little bit about later. This is where they essentially see the beginning of the need to have an organized response, a politically political organized response to the evangelicals coming in and really accentuating what's already there. I say this because, right, we are giving a bad rap to the evangelicals, and they deserve a certain highlight, but there is a long history of Christians in the country, right? Since the Concordat, I don't know how to say that in English, of 1860, right? Concordat of 1860, when the Catholic Church is reinvited, right, into Haiti, where there's anti-superstitious campaigns over and over and over again. So I think we should also remember that there's a larger context for which they're able to even come and make this much inroad into Haiti. And what we see, and there's a lot of work produced about that there needs to be somewhat of a compliant state who also has that same vision or a similar vision of civilizing these unruly Blacks, right? And Christianity understood as this thing, right? This tool that is going to civilize these African Haitians, right? So I think even if we want to put an accent on the evangelicals, we can't forget the long history of Christians at large in the country. But what I want to say that is different or seems different about this moment is that inside the churches, there's a direct attack, right, against the law, which is not necessarily something that we see inside the churches in the sermons of the Catholics. Right? At least recent research is showing that, right? The Catholics sort of are shy away from directly naming the laws. The evangelicals are talking about Ezuli, they're talking about Ogun in the middle of their church sermons. And the new thing is also an attack against LGBTI people, the community M, right? In ways that, because this category of being that didn't exist in the way that it does today and named the way that it is today, they were not a direct focus, right? So I think those are the things that are new, but what is similar is that there has to be a kind of state, which is the state that we find in Haiti, that's going to allow this kind of NGO missionary work to take place, right? And to be able to spread into the space. So I'll end there. I see Dr. Pierre, you had put some kind of a hand up.
Yes, my apologies. I just wanted to jump in on this long history. Excuse me, Brooklyn is being Brooklyn, and I must mute it for a second. Hold. Yes, okay. So what I wanted to add about the long history of Christianity penalizing racialized bodies. So when we're thinking about, when we're thinking about the launch of the British colonial enterprise in the Americas, when we're looking at those primary sources, you have these people who are coming from a Protestant Christian tradition, and they are recruiting working poor white men, and I'm using white men very loosely because whiteness is a concept that emerges along with colonization. So you have these working poor white men who are being told, we are going to colonize the Americas in order to rescue the natives from this evil Catholic Pope. So the hand of empire is always wedded with certain aspects of the Christian philosophy. So I'm not talking about the Ethiopian Christian tradition, which becomes part of how African people liberate themselves through Christianity. But when you have this logic in the Protestant tradition of we're coming to rescue you from some sort of inherent evil, Haiti, the political meeting that happens at Bwa Kayiman, it simply fills in the slot that was once occupied by we're coming to save the indigenous American. So what's happening with Black people, African people, as it relates to Christianity, pacts with Satan? We see the same discourse centuries prior to the Haitian Revolution. So I just want to throw that out there as Dr. Doge Prosper was talking, because the Africans who are coming into Haiti at the end of the 18th century, these people have been ravaged by war long before they got here. So these are people who have experienced fighting. There was a war of jihad in the late 18th century. So these people are very clear about different spiritual traditions. So when they're hearing this language of being punished, it's in many ways, it's old news, but at that political Congress, they're trying to highlight the common denominator that connects them in order to make this oath. So I just wanted to throw that into the conversation.
You know, as I hear you speak, it makes me think of how the US imperialist enterprise has always been associated with religion, in this case, American Christianity. And right before the invasion of Puerto Rico in 1898, the military met with the 7 mainline denominations in the United States so that they could soften up the people in Puerto Rico and quote unquote Christianize them and make them good American citizens. So it's hard to detach religion and politics. And especially in the case of Haiti, it seems to me like Voodoo has been used to scare people about the Haitian people. And as you speak, I'm thinking that, well, I've always told my students that it seems to be the most maligned tradition of the African-based traditions, to the point that very few people, sometimes even practitioners, would say, I practice Voodoo. It's almost easier to say Lukumi tradition. And I always tell my students how powerful discourses are, because dominant Christian culture will malign the traditions and rituals of the African-based religions as if they're primitive, bizarre, diabolical. but they could go in the millions and eat the body of a dead man and drink the blood, and that's considered primitive or bizarre. You could say, to run for president, I was at mass yesterday eating the body of Jesus who died 2,000 years ago and drinking his blood. But if you say I was at a Voodoo ritual ceremony last night, that's the end of your campaign. And there's no logic to it, but it works to oppress people. I don't know if you have an answer for this, but why do you think that Voodoo has been maligned almost more than any other religious tradition? I don't understand it, and I asked the question sincerely. I mean, I guess intellectually I understand it to some extent, but I don't understand it. I don't know if I'm making sense. Anyone want to take a crack at that?
You're making tremendous sense, Dr. Cruz, and I'm so grateful to you for bringing up this incredibly important parallel in Christianity of consuming the body of Christ, imbibing the blood of Christ as a cannibalistic religious act. That's not framed as such. That's not framed as such in the West because this is considered to be a dominant religious tradition. And I have so many thoughts. Let me start by saying, to build upon my fellow colleagues' mention of the religious plurality of the Bwa Kayiman ceremony, what presents as so unique in Haiti is that its isolation between 1804 and 1860 allows for a concretizing of indigenous African religions to re-indigenize in a new context. And I do not say this to diminish the importance of Taino indigenous cultures of the Americas, but rather to note that these African indigenous traditions that had already been undergoing change and evolution in the Americas further underwent a certain degree of evolution, because between 1804 and 1860, the Vatican removed all French missionaries, all French clergy that had been in Haiti that were not killed during the revolution and who had not fled during the revolution. Haiti is placed under an embargo between 1804 and 1860. And so what's fascinating is who steps up to take the roles as Catholic priests, but Africans. As Dr. Piel mentioned, the vast majority of peoples who were fighting during the Revolutionary War and who were of Black descent were from the continent themselves. And possibly as many as 60 to 70% of enslaved Africans who fought during the Revolutionary War were coming from Central Africa, from the kingdoms of Congo, from Ndongo, from Cabinda. What does this mean? We have to contextualize the fact that Haitians were building upon Africanized Catholicisms that had existed on the continent before arrival. So in 1491, King Nzinga Nku converts to Catholicism. He has two sons who battle over the kingdom in Central Africa. The Catholic son wins the battle. King Afonso converts the kingdom of Congo to Catholicism. And you have really an institutionalizing of this blend of African Catholicism with indigenous religious traditions, right? And so between 1804 and 1860, if the people who are predominantly Catholic are African and have been blending on the African continent, their version of Catholicism, in which Jesus was Black and Mary was Black and God was Black and Congo was actually, the site of Jerusalem in Mbanza, Congo, then you have a profound experience by which Haitians are further Africanizing the Catholicism that has been introduced to them in the continental context for Congolese peoples and who are being introduced to an African Catholicism in the Americas. Voodoo also takes root during this time. And I'm so glad that Dr. Duje-Prospero mentioned the anti-superstition campaigns. We have to understand that the anti-superstition campaigns were enacted not simply by foreign powers in the Catholic Church, but also by Haitian state members themselves. There were Haitian political leaders who felt very strongly that participating in Haitian Vodou would be a way of remaining primitive, of being tied to an uncivilized past, and that to advance society, to advance oneself, and to really build a nation that would be successful, one would have to become Catholic, right, and leave behind all African traditions. So that was my backstory. I'll try to wrap up my comment here because I think it's such an important question regarding why has Haiti been so maligned. I think there are a lot of different reasons for this, but I think that Haiti represents the most African in the Americas, right? We know that actually Brazil received far more enslaved Africans than any other region. 5 million of the 12 to 15 million enslaved Africans who were brought to the Americas were taken to Brazil, right? A measly 500,000, though devastating in actuality, but numerically speaking, only 500,000 enslaved peoples were brought to the United States. So think about that gap and disparity, right? But Haiti, because it gains its independence from the French, because Napoleon is whooped so badly that he sells the Louisiana Territory to the United States, right? Because Haiti has taken on the role of really a martyr in some ways, but the martyr who survives is not a martyr, Haiti becomes the most African. And I think that this is a prime example of Afrophobia in demonizing Haitian Vodou. This is a prime example of the irrational fear of Africa, of Africanness. It is a prime example of anti-Blackness. And finally, and this is where I draw from the work of fellow scholars Daniel Boaz and Rachel Cantave, who conduct research on Candomblé in Brazil. This is what Candomblé devotees refer to as religious racism, right? Meaning that you're not simply talking about racism and anti-Blackness, and you're not simply talking about religious prejudice against Vodou. You're speaking about a prejudice that is rooted in racism. People are afraid of Vodou and demonize Vodou because of its Blackness, and specifically because of its Africanness. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Dr. Duje Prosper, how do we understand matters of religious plurality in Haiti when people are involved in more than one tradition?
Yes, I wanted to say something piggybacking off of what Dr. Daniel said, and it's both a comment and a question, because I think looking at the other Afro-traditional religions, there's something about Voodoo that is different in terms of the power that women can have and the role that they can play, right, which is the one of the most powerful roles, right, that you can have even in a religion that's not hierarchical, right, but in terms of knowledge holding, in terms of, right, imparting healing, in terms of commanding others. And I think that there's something about that also makes Vodou in Haiti threatening, right, in ways that perhaps other traditions like Lukumi, which do have restrictions on how far women can go, right, in the hierarchy, present. So I wanted to put that out, that I think that there's something there, and would like, this is why I'm saying it's a comment and a question to Dr. Daniels and to you too, Dr. Cruz and Dr. Pierre, right, about this sort of challenge to heteronormativity that Vodou proposes and pushes and centers in ways that the other African-based traditions don't always, right? It's always more silence. So to your question about religious plurality, there's a group of us who have been trying to conduct research for some years now. And of course, we haven't been able to cover all the territory that we would have wanted to, but we did spend a significant amount of time in the Port-au-Prince metropolitan area. And there's also other work by other scholars, for example, on the celestial armies, right, which is really this blend between Protestantism and Voodoo, and we could talk about that a little later. But in the neighborhood of Bel Air, which is in Port-au-Prince, what we've been able to find is actually what you're saying, and what I think Dr. Daniels is pointing to, right? That people are able to live in the interstices of, right, Christianity and Voodoo. And I think there's a wonderful quote that I'm paraphrasing here by one of our interlocutors, right? He says, yeah, like we share the chairs, like on Sunday they're using the chairs for their service, and maybe on a Thursday we're having a ceremony and we're using the same chairs. As a matter of fact, sometimes we're using the same exact sacred space, right? Where one day you're calling on Dambala and another day you're calling on Jesus, right? So that, and it's not true of all neighborhoods, right? But in this particular, and all true of all communities that we've been able to visit. And there's something about the fact that where there aren't these white Protestants who are coming in and proselytizing directly, there is more of a marriage between the two, or more of a, if you want, a tolerance and even a sliding, right? So into one and the other. One guy says, yeah, you know, she's a born again Christian next week, but you know, you catch her next month. She's going to be at the ceremony because she has a different need, right? That the church cannot answer to. So, and maybe in different parts, right, where the white evangelicals are physically there. And, you know, I know Dr. McAllister, Elizabeth McAllister had done some research in Saint-Marc, or even some attacks on, you know, the historical site of Bwa Kayiman. Wherever the white evangelicals are physically present, there seems to be a little bit more of a clash, right? But when they are removed from the situation, I think people are in their communities and they're in the same families sharing the space, right? So I think this is what, at least this particular neighborhood and some of the other metropolitan area neighborhoods of Port-au-Prince neighborhoods has shown us so far, is that people are living in this plurality. And it's also, again, connected to the way that people have experienced Catholicism, not new, right? That people have always come in and out, have always married them. And there's not a contradiction necessarily between the two. And I think that's important to lift up. So I'll stop there, but I think there's something about, you know, I would like for us to tease out this little question about, you know, the challenge to heteronormativity that Voodoo poses, and why, for example, the Communauté M in Haiti, and I want to say the Communauté M is the equivalent of how we use LGBTI in the United States. So M, each M, ma sisi, ma divine, mix, ma commun, mon compère, they all start with M's. So this is why they've been regrouped under Communauté M, and they essentially follow the LGBT acronym that we use here. But you know, oftentimes LGBT people, Communauté M people, find that they can be open and feel safe and practice and be leaders within Vodou spaces, right? It's not true in all Vodou spaces. I think that, you know, we have to be careful about not overgeneralizing. And there are many people in the Communauté M who are like, I don't do Vodou, I'm a Protestant, you know, I'm a fervent Catholic. And, you know, often find, you know, that they've been rejected from their congregation and, you know, may choose to abandon or to hide their particular sexual identities. But right, I think that that's the power that Vodou has, is to be able to create an open space that challenges certain heteronormative, you know, logics that I think some other African traditional, African-based traditions do not. And then this is, you know, my challenge, my comment, but my question too, that I'm putting out there.
I think, as I reflect, I think two things. In terms of religious plurality, or what we Latinx religious scholars call multiple religious affiliations, I think it's important to mention that there's this new movement in the United States about interreligious dialogue, but African religions are left out, are not part of the dialogue, and they're missing out and perhaps learning how to really do multiple religious affiliations at the same time, when we've been doing it for hundreds of years, and there must be a knack to it. Secondly, when you speak of the sexuality, I tell my students all the time, and in fact, today I was saying that spirit religions are much more egalitarian and break down the hierarchies that exist. And I haven't done a study of this because I would be too big, but I haven't yet met Santero priest who's not gay. And they're exalted for being gay because it's looked at as a higher manifestation of reality. And it's interesting to me because these Black religions are much more open to diversity of sexuality and fluidity. And we're always called hyper homophobic, Black and Latino people. And I wonder if that's just, I believe it's just a way to denigrate our culture because there's no real evidence of that. Probably there's evidence to the contrary. but our religious traditions are much more open to trans people and to the LGBT community. In fact, I think many people believe that if you are gay or bisexual or lesbian, you're at a higher spiritual plane. It's not looked down upon and condemned. It's considered something valuable. So I think this panel is exciting because there's so much to learn from our people that dominant curriculums and discourses in this country don't take advantage of. And it's because like Dr. Daniel said earlier, it's religious racism. It's theological racism that's going on. Could you speak a little bit more about the Communauté M? Just a little more about that.
Sure. I think at the beginning when I was talking about this moment when you have all the NGOs really being part of the recolonization of Haiti in 2010, or the intensification of this recolonization process, there's also something else that's happening, right? So the homo nationalist agenda, right, of the UN apparatus of the US is also operating and coming to, describe Haiti as a place, that is very homophobic, right, where LGBTI people are being targeted for violence. And it's not to say that that's not true, but it's that it's, again, this is a sort of the flip side of what the evangelicals are doing, right, is saying that this is a particularly dangerous place, right, for LGBTI people, as if in the United States it's a very safe place. And so that's being used to, again, disqualify Haiti as not civilized, right? So the evangelicals are doing it to say that Haiti is not civilized because it has, right, people who are not heterosexual. And then you have this homo nationalist agenda through the UN apparatus saying that, right, it's extremely homophobic because the LGBTI people are dying, right, and are being killed and targeted. So there's truth to that, obviously, that they're being targeted. This is what I said earlier. But, in the middle of this contradiction, right, of empire, the Communauté M is also finding an opportunity to organize itself, right, into organizations. So, whatever the competing discourses are, right, they're going to benefit from some funding to be able to put together organizations that are, and there's a lot of research that has been done on it, and that, the Working Group on Sexualities and Haitian Studies, which I'm part, where, we're still doing that work, showing that, the funds are being used first and foremost also to provide, right, shelter and to provide a direct response to folks who, right, because LGBT folks are part of the larger population that is impoverished, right, and are experiencing, all kinds of discrimination. So certainly there's an emphasis to give them, right, the services that they're lacking in terms of healthcare, right, because again, this is a place where they're discriminated, or even offering some kind of, this is a call being made now, right, vocational skills, because again, universities and other places of learning are discriminating against them, specifically, right, when they're expressing their gender in non-normative ways. So there's a back and forth, right, an interchanging of LGBTQ and Communauté M, and there's a particular organization, Courage, and the leader has now, he was murdered. There's a new leader, but this original leader, right, well, part of what he was pushing for, Charles Jeudi, was indigenizing this concept, right, to say that this is not some kind of foreign import, right, because this is what we were hearing a lot from members of the state. That in 2016, there was an attempt by the Senate, the men of God in the Senate, to bring about a law that would strike down the possibility of same-sex marriage. Because again, the idea is that any LGBTQ agenda must be reduced to same-sex marriage, right? As opposed to the actual needs of the Communauté M in Haiti, right, is to generally what the larger population is asking for, right? And maybe not in so many words, but a retreat of the neoliberal agenda. But anyway, essentially what we see is that the Communauté M begins to organize politically, right? They end up registering their organizations with the ministry, with the state, so they're recognized officially to function in the space. And they do a lot of work inside the communities, inside the school, even with the police, right, to sensibilize people to the existence of LGBTQ people and how to respond to them when, for example, they report, right, acts of violence against them. But they're also doing, right, a lot of the political education work inside of their organization with the community. And there's a lot of folks, reporting the importance of having visible organizations, right? That now I can find people who are like me, right? Instead of always existing in opposition to. But to go back to the question at hand about Voodoo, I think Dr. Daniels could elaborate on that more, I'm sure. Voodoo is a space generally that even the folks who say I'm a fervent Protestant also report being extremely open and safe to their presence, right? And their full presence, not hiding anything about them. And particularly when you say, Dr. Cruz, are transgender people, find that this is a place where they can be completely themselves, right? In ways that they're rejected at large by society and by their families. So I think there's something about, again, Voodoo that is extremely special, right? And makes Haiti, by connection, extremely special in terms of being a safe place for LGBT people. And so I want to go back before I end about the community and the importance that Charles Jeudi marked about using Creole words, right? Words in Haitian Creole to denote sexual identity and sexual categories. In several interviews he gives, and he went on, national radio stations to explain this. He says, he drops the word Masisima Divine, which, up until 2010 and still today, even though the work is being done, are considered derogatory words, right? He says, but they shouldn't be, right? That he says, you've used these words to hurt us, right? But what these words prove is that in the language of our foremothers and forefathers, like, we have always existed. And these are not words coming out of, right, the West or the North, right? That these are words that are embedded in Haitian Creole and therefore, right, in Haitian being. So I think this is why it's important, in the work that we do to use Communauté M and to force, right, our Western, Northern audience to rethink that category. Though, we interchange sometimes to, ensure comprehension.
Thank you. Dr. Pierre, would you like to make some comments on how Voodoo has been so maligned?
Absolutely. So my direct response to that question, why Voodoo is the most maligned of the African syncretic religions, is the political meeting that begins at Bwa Kayiman launches the liquidation of assets held in human bodies. When we're thinking about the political economy of the enslaved Atlantic, property held in humans are the most valuable asset. So when you have a spiritual religious tradition that can completely undermine that and quote unquote convince people that I am not someone's property, that has the possibility, and there is evidence of revolts happening after, concurrent to the Haitian Revolution, where people are using the Haitian example to liberate themselves. But I just wanna do a brief exercise that I do with my students all the time so that they can get away from this idea that racism caused slavery. People created racism because of hatred. These types of emotive arguments have never made sense to me because colonization is about enterprise. So let me just share my screen really quickly, and I'm gonna stop my video because that tends to make it go faster. So, oh wait, I don't know how to stop my video, but that's all right, we're gonna keep it moving. So this is an inflation calculator. I'm not entirely sure about the math, but I've spoken to some colleagues in math and they say that the math to calculate the inflation values are pretty sound. So I'm just going to put in a very quote unquote low ball estimate for human life at the start of the Haitian Revolution, so 1791, a lowball price for an enslaved person who was likely maimed or elderly would be about anywhere from $200 to $350. But again, let's think about this context. We have the French Revolution. There are shipping restrictions happening throughout the late 18th century. So this is a very conservative estimate. Once we put that in the inflation calculator, $350 in 1791 is about 10 grand. Multiply that by the conservative estimate that there were 500,000 enslaved Africans in Haiti. And I say that that number is conservative because when we go into the footnotes of Thomas Madieu, one of the most cited 19th century historians of Haiti, he lets us know in this footnote that people who were above a certain age weren't counted in the census because they were seen as being less valuable than young men, young women, and children under a certain age weren't counted in those numbers. So Madieu puts the number of enslaved Africans living on Haiti during the Haitian Revolution upwards to 700 to 800,000 people. So when you multiply that, and this is a very conservative estimate that is not looking at how prices for enslaved bodies go up during times of war. And we are squarely in a time of war at the end of the 18th century. So to bring it back to the question as to why voodoo is the most maligned, it is because of the liquidation of assets in Black bodies. Once you have that as an example, a successful example, one, you must always punish it. You must always punish that example. So our one of our Haitian poets, why is his name escaping me? But in any case, he makes the argument that Haiti is the only nation with the last name, poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. So this is the reason why you need to tack on, you need to bury the reality that these people were seen as assets and their belief in their religious spiritual traditions undermined the entire political economy of the enslaved Atlantic. So this is why voodoo is the most maligned, and I'll stop there.
Thank you.
I'm loving this economic analysis added to the religion discussion. Yes.
Yes. You know, I was thinking, our time is coming up. There's going to be questions from people who have been watching, but just if you wanted to comment on this, the resiliency, how people fight back in ways that we don't realize they're fighting back. For example, despite all the maligning of voodoo, it's alive and going forward. And I was thinking of these evangelicals that are going to Haiti and throughout the world lately, how they are assuming that the evangelicalism that they're bringing to Haiti and other parts of the world is pure, and it's going to stay pure. But people, I think people are going to use it to some extent to practice their own traditions. You could find this in throughout the Caribbean, that people, well, we just said multiple religious affiliations, they won't be able to necessarily, they do damage, but not completely. People are resourceful and will fight back. I know I published a book called Mask Africanisms, Puerto Rican Pentecostalism. And a lot of ethnographers go interview Spiritists and Pentecostals and they can't tell the difference. So people have co-opted and taken in what they, their roots, their African roots are not that easily extinguished, despite all the forces and strong forces that come towards us. But how have you seen the resiliency of the Haitian people when it comes to their culture? Could anyone or all of you say something about the strength and the resiliency, the power? It's not all negative. There's negative forces from outside, but people continue to survive and maintain themselves.
I'll try to respond to that question weaving it together with some things that Dr. Piel and Dr. Duje-Prospiel have indicated. So first of all, I want to say that I think it's really important that we recognize the stakes that are at place here in talking about Haiti is not a cursed nation, right?
Mhm.
My students, shout out to my students who are in my introductory classes, my students who are in my advanced seminars, I always say the same thing to them, which is that when you're talking about the demonization of these religious traditions, it's not as simple as, oh, well, this isn't a religion that's practiced by very many people, so it must not be that big of a deal. In 2010, you had not only Pat Robertson suggesting, and I mean, saying quite explicitly that Haiti has made a pact with the devil, but you had missionaries who were coming to Haiti and kidnapping children whose parents could not be found to put them up for adoption, smuggling children out of the country so that they could be placed up for adoption, right? You had missionaries who were coming to Haiti in 2010 who were saying, we will not provide food, we will not provide shelter, we will not provide education unless you burn your temples. Right? You have centuries of practices of state-sanctioned violence that is harming not only religious devotees of Haitian Vodou, but the entire community. I mean, you have Protestants who as early as the 1850s are burning down trees. Why? Because in the words of Edwidge Danticat, trees were the first temples, right? You have a religious tradition that is tied to the land, that is tied to the mountains and to the air, burning down trees which serve as a source of livelihood in terms of creating shelter, in terms of making sure that floods do not devastate a nation, is a form of environmental catastrophe that is self-inflicted because Protestants are certain that Haitian Vodouism cannot continue their religious tradition. So the stakes are quite high. That's something that I just want to underscore in our conversation here. Regarding the question of resiliency, Dr. Cruz, I really do appreciate you raising this. And I would like to direct everybody to a really fantastic article by a scholar named Ryan Jiha. Actually, I believe he's a journalist. He's of Haitian descent, and he's written a really fantastic essay that has a very provocative title about something like resiliency is a foil. Really, it's a foil because, you know, in addition to Haiti having this last name, poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, as Dr. Piel points out, right, there is always this discussion of, well, the Haitian people are so resilient. Resiliency removes accountability from Western imperialist powers and neo-colonial regimes, right? Nobody asks to experience sexual assault. Okay, nobody asks to experience hegemony. So to call Haitians resilient is in some ways, it's supposed to be a compliment, right? It's supposed to indicate how we can continue to fight back, but we shouldn't have to fight for our livelihood. We shouldn't have to fight for what it means to be free in 1791 and 1804 and what it means to continue to be our true selves today. That said, I do think it's helpful to consider the ways that we continue to endure, that we can continue to persevere, and this notion of longevity. So Dr. Cruz, to answer your question, I'm gonna link it back to Dr. Duje-Prospier's mention of the heteronormativity that is placed into question, if you will. So I'm going to actually end with that as a sort of reflection to leave time for my panelists. I'll say that, the term masisi itself, which refers to gay men, is possibly rooted to mamasisi, which comes from the term for devotees of Mamiwata in West Africa. Mamiwata is a spirit of the sea, of the ocean. And so it's possible that even this term of a devotee, because it was understood and still is today, when you identify yourself as a devotee of the religious tradition of Yoruba cultures, of Vodou cultures of West Africa, you identify yourself as a wife of the spirit, regardless of gender, regardless of sexuality, right? Ma divine, that sounds like my divine in French. This could be a hot take, but I'd be interested in, some etymological discussions of that. And so when you have spirits like Simbi who are gender fluid, when you have spirits like El Judi d'Antan who engage in relationships with both masculine divine energies and feminine divine energies, who are understood as the ones who make humans queer or gender fluid, how can you disrespect spirit by harming somebody who is queer, who is mix, who is makome, right? I think that is where you can see some of the really powerful lessons that Vodou has to teach the world. So I'll end there.
Thank you. Dr. Duje-Prosper.
Yes, I was like wrapped up, Dr. Daniels. I was like hanging on, and then you dropped the mic. I wanted to say I'm glad that you brought up, this constant connection between Haiti and resilience. So I won't repeat that. But I will say, some of what we're seeing coming out in the research, and, this is, we'll see how it continues to evolve, is that there's certainly commodification of Voodoo that's happening, right? That as people are looking for ways to survive in the colony, right, they are also understanding the power of being able to heal others or to do, right, certain readings in order to make some money, right? That being said, I think that there are powerful continuations, as Dr. Daniels is pointing out, that endure with Vodou culture in general, right? So I think this is when we stop thinking about it as a religion, but as a way of life. There's a way that, right, the Laku understanding that came, from the rural parts have endured even in the cities. And you see people sharing resources, right? They're living together and sharing food, but also I think what's powerful is the continuation of, right, conceptualizing the family as non-heteronormative, right, as being very plural, as being multi-generational, as being able to be led by women. I think those are the things that for me stand out about what Voodoo continues to do, even in places like Port-au-Prince that are, considered more urban. And this communalism endures, right? And it has to, in order to respond to the deleterious effects of neoliberal capitalism in Haiti, right? That people have been abandoned by the state generally, right? They're not receiving any kind of support from the state. And this is part of this neoliberal agenda. And I'm sure, we can talk about it having, this is a historical logic anyway, in terms of how Haiti, the uses of Haiti, where people are finding ways to respond and to fill in for the state. That's not just, right, going to the NGOs, but really looking at themselves in their community. And so I think, like, if anything, that's in the ways that Vodou as a way of life endures in this space, even with all these epithets that we attach to Haiti, right, as a poorest nation, that this is how people are able to live everyday life, right? And this is not necessarily to romanticize it, right? I'm not in any way denying the hardships of people, or that somehow the state should not take on the role that it should have or that it claims to have. But I think this is something that's worth noting that continues to exist in the space.
Thank you. Dr. Pierre?
So much of what I feel about, much of what I think about resiliency, Dr. Daniels put it out there, but there's actually, I want to read a brief snippet from something I wrote about my experience in the earthquake. One of the compliments that I received often after the earthquake was, Natalie, you're so resilient. Natalie, you're keeping in the tradition of nous l'aide, mais nous là. This ethos of perpetual suffering as a sign of strength. So I just want to read just one brief paragraph and then that's it. But in short, resiliency is not a trope that I like to underscore, because our Haitian ancestors died so that we could live, so that we could thrive in some ways. So I'm just going to read now. So the title of this is Notes of a Haitian Daughter, written by me. From beneath the earth's surface, a thunderbolt lashed up to crack Port-au-Prince's shell. The roar of crumbling mountain merged with the shrieks of children, men and women. Here and there, the expression Sang de Jésus punctuated our collective death sentence. I sat on the balcony of the Hospice Saint-Joseph, a medical clinic doubling as a bed and breakfast, confused and silently wondering where this thunderous train would emerge. It took a wooden entertainment unit rushing across the linoleum floor for me to realize there were no trains in Haiti. Before the inevitable crash, I fell to my hands and knees into an embrace of chalky rubble. The dust invaded my lungs, blinded my eyes, and tinted my locks a grayish white. On my forearms, I crawled toward my yelping hostess and used her calves to pull myself upright. The building squirmed like jello and melted beneath my bare feet. Still mute, I followed her counsel and said, God, when a fresh burst of smoky rubble tickled my throat. I chose to keep my mouth shut for survival and continue to do so for years. This collection provides me an opportunity to speak, and I can speak again because bearing witness is itself a value. So I'm just going to stop there. This is a scene of resiliency. But I also know that in the same way that my country was broken, my psyche was broken, but I had this beautiful label of you're so strong, you're so resilient. And that is not where I needed to be. And that is not where I recommend any of current Haitian earthquake survivors to be. We need to tap into the religious, spiritual epistemologies of our ancestors and find strength in all of the tools that they used. So religious plurality. In my household, Saturday night, we're at Sevis. Sunday morning, we're at Catholic Church. There was no confusion in my household. It's once I stepped out into public, into the sphere of white supremacy, that there was a disorientation. And in order to move past resiliency, I needed to come back into the space of my home where these things were not at odds with each other. So down with resiliency, in with our cultural epistemologies, and I'll stop there.
Thank you for those comments on resiliency. It reminded me of Dr. James Cone, the father of Black liberation theology, who really rejected, although it's not the same thing, but it reminded me of it, the notion of redemptive suffering. You know, like if through suffering, redemption could happen. He totally rejected that notion because it's been used to keep people where they're at. And to some extent, resiliency could be looked at as a way of not focusing on what really has to be done for liberation. Resilience is not enough. Surviving is not enough. We need to live, like you just said. I know we are going to open up now to questions from those who have been watching, and
Yes.
I'll turn it over to Nyya and Bridget.
Yes, thank you so much. And just to give our speakers a quick second, we're going to take a little bit of break. I don't know if you can go to the bathroom at this little bit of a break, but just rest your voice for a second, because first I would like to introduce Bridget Webster, a 2021 graduate of Union Theological Seminary, whose research focused on psychology and religion, but also the intersections of hip hop and theology, and the sacred in hip hop, another maligned Black tradition and lifestyle and way of doing spirit on earth. And so we're so grateful to her. I asked Bridget not only to pose some questions, but as you all know, Dr. Cruz is hosting a fundraiser for grassroots leaders in Haiti, one of them being a Voodoo Ugan, and this Ugan's temple experienced a fire this summer. This Ugan, who his name is Jean-Daniel Lafontant, he also is going through some medical procedures, and so we are here to support him. He has been a great partner to us, writing many chapters and words for Dr. Cruz's forthcoming book on African religions in the Americas. And so we would like to support him, but also we will be supporting a community organizer who wrote a letter to us all from Jérémie. And on August 14th, anniversary of Bwa Kayiman this year, August 14th, 2021, there was an earthquake in Jérémie, which isn't anywhere near Bwa Kayiman, but is on the south side of Haiti. But our people experienced, not only trauma on top of their 2010 trauma, but a natural disaster. And we're knowing that the entire Caribbean and many Black countries around the world are experiencing environmental disasters. So I'm asking Bridget to read this letter from Preston C. And about what he will be doing with the funds.
First of all, let me just start by saying a huge thank you to everyone who donated. Your donations will help a lot of families who are currently struggling after the earthquake that happened. With your donations, we intend to supply a safe house with food and water and supplies for those who are in desperate need and without shelter. Currently, the few donations that have reached the village have been taken by others who have come from outer villages nearby and caused riots in pursuit of the supplies given, leaving the true villagers of Jérémie without. I also intend to use any donations given to rebuild my mother's house that was used in the past as a safe haven for those who were in need. Villagers knew that they could come to the house and at the very least get a hot cup of coffee to help with them on the rest of their journey home. We ourselves didn't have much, but we were always willing to share with those who were less fortunate. My mother passed away 2 years ago, and the house she lived in crumbled during the earthquake. My intentions are clear and very simple, and that is to use the funds that are donated to rebuild the small village of Jérémie by rebuilding the people first. Thank you very much, and God bless you. Sincerely, Preston Auguste.
Thank you so much, Bridget. And so if all of our viewers are able to donate at least $20 tonight, we can reach our goal that will allow us to build a really grassroots center in Jérémie, and also rebuild a community center, a spiritual center. People actually live at John Daniel's temple, so a home for people, and really put our money behind this conversation. So we're gonna jump into conversations. I know I'm supposed to have 3 minutes, but if you all could stay with us, I'm sure you've been enjoying this conversation as much as I have. So we have 3 questions, powerful questions for our speakers tonight. And the first one comes from someone very dear to my heart and dear to all of us at Union, Joshua Campbell. And he's asking, having just passed Halloween, can you all speak to Hollywood and popular culture, the caricatures of voodoo, zombies, and how they all play a part in Haiti's character assassination? And while you're thinking about that, what I will say is I have lots of thoughts about this. Maybe they come from my Pentecostal mother and all of this stuff, but I am still bashing Halloween because I do feel it's an interesting day for Americans and what they dress up as. And I almost feel Halloween is not to be celebrated by Americans, because every other day they are these, scary and deeply disturbed things that they dress up as. They don't dress up as, as in Fèt Gede black and purple. They're dressing up, as serial killers and all of these things. Maybe their kids are Power Rangers or thieves or something, but I'm like, you don't need a costume for those things. So I just wanted to share that in an open space since Joshua and I are on the same page. But yes, if we could talk about Halloween and just voodoo with 2 O's and 2, VOODOO versus Haitian voodoo. I think that would be an interesting conversation.
I'll just say this much, that first of all, I don't know that most US Americans are even aware of the roots of the zombie, right? And it's become like a global phenomenon, and Haiti's been extracted from it. but it certainly is the result of the US occupation in Haiti in the early 20th century, and how, right, these images and these ideas of Haiti were coming out of that moment, right? So that I would like to lift that up here. I don't have too much to say about, the Hollywood using this, because again, I think most people don't realize this connection to Haiti unless, you have studied Haiti, but it's coming out of that moment, right? When the US goes into Haiti, right? You have US Marines coming out of the US South, coming into Haiti, imposing Jim Crow, right? And having a certain, already a certain understanding of Black people, right? Based on their experiences in the US South, and then coming into Haiti and finding, right, as Dr. Daniels pointed out, Dr. Daniels and I are good friends. So it's like really hard to keep calling her that. I'm like, Kira,
yeah, that's fine, of course.
But,
we were just, performing the intellectual accolades.
Right? But that, as Dr. Daniels pointed out, right, that Haiti is, essentially African standing in the Americas, right? So it's like the most African place in the Americas. So there's something about it, right, when these US Marines come in, and you also have Protestants coming in, right? So the occupation is not just military, right? It's also coming in with all these other social, economic arms. And so, they're importing these images to sort of re-justify why they're even in Haiti, right? These unruly Blacks who are uncivilized and who worship the devil. And that's all part of essentially applauding themselves for having gone into the country to civilize the place. So I'll just say this about sort of the historical context of, exporting the zombie figure to the US and how Hollywood takes that on. But I don't know if anybody wants to add on that.
Or I'll hop in, and I'm so grateful, Dr. Duje-Pospel, that you're mentioning the military occupation. It's like the one time period of great importance that we didn't speak about in depth, and it's such an important time period because it's when white Americans are introduced to Haitian religious culture really in depth, right? And that's when they come back and write texts like Seabrook's Magic Island, create films like White Zombie. And there are, really the zombie apocalypse continues to be a fascinating fixation, really, of the Western world. And I have a few different answers for this. I'm currently teaching a course called Vodou, Not Voodoo, Media Distortions and Lived Religion in Haiti. So I'm really shouting out all my students who might be watching. I think it's such an important topic. Again, I think, it's easy to imagine that this is not a big deal, but it is a big deal because, in fact, there are so many different ways that this comes up, right? So to your point, Dr. Cruz, earlier you mentioned two things. One thing is that you mentioned nobody makes light of, the consumption of the body of Christ and the imbibing of the blood of Jesus Christ, right? My partner, my husband, has also mentioned that in thinking about the crucifix, no other religious tradition's symbol to serve as the representation of an entire religious community is the brutal massacre and crucifixion of a religious divine figure, right? And so even thinking about the crucifix, I can't think of something more gory, more bloody, more ghoulish, but that's not what is portrayed as troubling. That's not what is portrayed, the voodoo doll, which doesn't really exist, actually, right? The zombie is what is concerned. Zombies actually are a metaphor for thinking about slavery, right? They are a metaphor for thinking about slavery because it is a way of moving through the world without compensation, with a suppressed sense of consciousness, unable to respond, but still fighting, right? Still present. So there are all of these different ways that we can sort of contextualize these misrepresentations. But let me, say that I think that there are so many other ways that we have of combating this with realities. Oh, that was the other thing, Dr. Cruz, that you mentioned. You would remove your likelihood for presidential candidacy if you mentioned anything about Vodou. I agree, unless you're George H.W. Bush Sr., who mentions voodoo politics in 1980, which is a term that continues voodoo economics, which continues to be something that economics use today to talk about something that's irrational, right? To talk about something that supposedly doesn't make sense. And so I think it's, it's helpful for us to ground these myths in the reality of their fixation in the Western world. So I'll wrap up that thought by saying, I actually think that the Western obsession with zombies and with voodoo dolls is really about the fact that white folks don't know how to mourn their dead anymore. I really think that's what it's about, because there's so many studies done of mortuary rites on the African continent. And in fact, many mortuary rites play a very important role, as do marriage rites, as do initiation rites, as do birthing rites. But you don't see the same fixation on those studies, right? And I think it's because white folks have forgotten how to mourn their dead. And so they come up with all of these ghoulish figures like vampires and like zombies who are the dead returned because they don't know how to continue honoring those ancestors. So I'm gonna just leave it at that.
Go ahead, Bridget. Go ahead, Bridget.
So we do have another question. This one comes from Nick Tillman on YouTube. And Nick asks, can we talk about the role that capitalism plays in the Western imperialist machine? It seems that at the heart of religious demonization is the desire to exploit pop. So can we talk about the role that capitalism plays in the Western imperialist machine?
Did you all catch that question? I think Bridget froze a little bit, right? Let me just read it one more time. I'm sorry. Yes, so from Nick Tillman on YouTube, can we talk about the role that capitalism plays in the Western imperialist machine? It seems that at the heart of religious demonization is the desire to economically exploit a population. Dr. Pierre?
Yeah, I'll definitely start with that great question. So we're going to take it back to the end of the Crusades, end of the 15th century. You have 800 years of Muslim domination of Iberia. Iberia becomes Portugal and Spain. So they're finally able to push out their Muslim rulers after 800 years of domination. These societies are economically dilapidated, and there are state-financed discovery missions in order to find places to colonize, to recoup treasuries after this 800 years of exploitation under Muslim rulers. So this age of discovery that we were taught about in grade school is actually the launch of the colonial enterprise. So you have this discovery of India, which is actually the Americas, which is actually the name of an Italian man who never made it to the Americas. But these historical inaccuracies aside, what is quantifiable is you need a group of laborers that are not covered by any European social contract or duty to the humanity of these people. So racial capitalism, I think, is a more refined way to think about Nick Tillman's question. So you have a hierarchy of people, this idea that you can put people in hierarchies. It's beginning in Southern Europe. It travels across the Atlantic with the earliest colonial entrepreneurs. And this idea that there are some people who are reducible to mere economic units, the African becomes part of that. So whenever we're thinking about the growth of capitalism, I want us to begin thinking about it as racial capitalism, because without the massive enslavement of African bodies, all of the progressive benefits of democracy, of global capitalism could not exist. And it exists on the racialization of Black bodies. It goes hand in hand. So when we're talking about ideas of democracy, when we're talking about ideas of free market capitalism, we must always render visible the people who were racialized, who were commodified in order for this launch. So I'll stop there to give my colleagues some time with that question also.
Actually, I think we're gonna jump to our last question just to respect everyone's time. And I wanna hear from all of you on this question. because it is my question. This conversation has been one that I really have always wanted to have. And what was like the tipping point, no longer waiting anymore to have this conversation, was with the assassination, something we haven't talked about. We have so many current events happening in Haiti. And so the one that we haven't talked about tonight yet is the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse. And so that happened early July. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's been so much. It's been a very hectic summer. And one, I want to say he was not a perfect person, right? And sometimes when people die, we make them into martyrs. But just weeks before he was assassinated, he was assassinating people, or hiring people to assassinate people. And I want to just state that in this space. But after he died, there was something that started to go around, that Jovenel died because of Voodoo, because of this relationship between Haiti and Voodoo. And actually, I heard it from the diaspora, the Haitian diaspora, so those not on the island. And I think we're getting, we've probably been here, but we're getting to a point where we're seeing more expression from Haitians in the diaspora that are aligning with these white evangelical thoughts that we've been talking about, that Haiti is cursed, that Haiti has sold itself to the devil, and I will never go there because I'm a child of God. And I think that takes on a different role when you are in the Americas, when you are in this American theological mainland, than it is when you're in Bel Air, right? And you're an evangelical and you might be able to be warm to both traditions. So I would like for us to talk about, or talk to maybe, the diaspora in this last few moments, because I think we need to keep ourselves accountable. And so I'm just going to end there. I don't really have too much of a question, but whatever this raises for you and the diaspora, what do you have to say to us?
What a question. That's a very, very interesting question. I mean, I'm gonna say it's sort of, I'm trying to make a connection between the previous question about imperialism and capitalism, and sort of the disconnect that that happens between these two concepts, right? So, to Dr. Pierre's point, and I think she was doing such a great job, like bringing us back to that longer history, right? There are enclosures also happening in Europe to prepare, Europeans to be the workers who are going to turn the raw materials that are being taken out of the Americas, right, from African labor. So imperialism already is, right, an extension of capitalism, or they come together, right? And I think there's a way we keep talking about, current events or things happening in the world, and capitalism is always removed from that discussion, right? So it's easy for Haitians to sort of, in the diaspora, to look at Haiti and not see it as a disaster, or really maybe it's not a disaster, but it is in the design of the capitalist system and the place that Haiti is given, right? And so it's easier to go to these other types of explanations rather than to really question the system under which we live. And we as diasporic Haitians benefit from, now that we're in the global north, right? That we couldn't come to understand that Jovenel's, Moïse's assassination is an infighting between the bourgeois class and certainly, right, different members of the state. And to your point about, Jovenel, who now is being, martyrized, right, was essentially aligning with a certain faction of the bourgeoisie and, dispossessing people of their lands and displacing them towards the larger project of his party, which is essentially these 4 axes of development, which is just another way to say, right, keep Haiti as a colony, keep minimum wages down so that Haitians are the cheapest labor in the region, so you can circulate them on various plantations within the borders and within also the region, right? Which is why we're seeing them ending up in the 10,000s at the US Mexico border. So it's just too easy, right, to just say do Vodou that Vodou's back is large, that we could just dump everything on it. But then no one wants to talk about the obvious reasons, why people, vie for power or struggle for power, which is profit, right? Which is wealth, which is the logic of capitalism, right? Profit over people. So it's just too easy for Haitian Americans to really buy into the logic of racial capitalism, right? Of the US presenting itself as, doing well, and without saying doing well off the backs of not only people within its borders, but across the territories that it controls. So I'll just say that, I don't know that there's an answer other than, take some of our classes, to get a broader explanation about what has happened historically, like, a big 500 years, but also in the last 10 years in Haiti, what's been going on, and to understand the phenomenon of Jovenel Moïse and what led up to his death, right? So I'll just say that much.
And I'll let Dr. Daniels close out on this question, so I'll just hop in. I just want to quote Malcolm X to the diasporic Haitians who have been misled. Who taught you to hate yourself? Who? One of the main arguments that I leverage to my Haitian American professional friends, one, your migration to the US with your upward mobility is a historical accident. So we could be the malheureux in Haiti right now. Depends on which US government was allowing immigrants into the country. So you need to always, one, remember that the representation of the Haitian American professional and our quote unquote rise, it is first and foremost a historical accident. Two, I actually learned this from Dr. Duge-Prosper, and that's where I'll end it. The language that we use to describe contemporary events in Haiti, we need to not make the same mistakes as observers from the early 19th century about the Haitian Revolution. So in the group chat, because you best believe there's a group chat amongst us, and Dr. Duge-Prosper offered up paramilitary as a way to understanding what the entire media is calling gang violence, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought that was a profound point, but unfortunately, Mamira, my texting skills suck. So I couldn't, but I was so on it because when you think about what's going on in relation to Moïse's assassination as a paramilitary conversation as opposed to gangs, you automatically see the political and economic stakes that these purported gang members have. In the early 19th century, when observers were looking at the behaviors of our revolutionary ancestors, they were convincing themselves that it was propaganda from white people that was being misconstrued by the captive Africans. These people have an understanding of freedom because most of them were not born here. So to the Haitian Americans who are being misled by this Moïse is dead because of voodoo narrative, I just want to remind you that at some point, Dessalines was understood to be a brigand, a savage. And we need to reconnect our ancestors to their political objectives in the same way that contemporary actors have their political objectives. And we are getting to watch this political process unfold. And it's very important to not let negative narratives of the past hamper our understanding of what's going on right now. So I just want to thank Dr. Duge-Prosper for bringing up, this is more of an international paramilitary problem as opposed to gangs or voodoo made Moïse die.
Hi, Woo-Woo. I'm so glad to be following my sister colleagues here, and I'm gonna try to keep it brief but meaningful. And I'll say that to the question about capitalism, with my students, we've talked about what the fake voodoo economics is, which is in fact something that is irrational, something that does not make sense, and specifically false promises made by political leaders. That's the context in which it was introduced in the United States by Bush Sr., Bush Padre, right? In the context of real voodoo economics, Cousin Zaka is a spirit of commerce. Well, no, he's a spirit of agriculture. He's actually nicknamed Ministre Agriculture, which is the Minister of Agriculture. I love our spirits have political titles too, y'all. And his wife, Cousine, is a savvy businesswoman, a savvy merchant. She is a Madame Sarah, but she is also the fierce guarder of the currency at home, which, as we know, is how a lot of Caribbean and African households operate, right? And so when we talk about the real Vodou economics, we're talking about susu, we're talking about sol, we're talking about me, we're talking about traditions of communal, shared, exchanges and monetary trust that's established in a democratic and socialist fashion, whereby, in this, money-saving institution known as Sol or Me in different parts of Haiti, everybody puts in money and one person serves as the recipient of that money, right? What does that mean? That is a threat to capitalism. That is a threat to major corporations and Citibank, which profited off of the French fighting against the Haitian Revolution, right? That is a direct threat to a capitalist market economy. And so when you have that sort of solidarity, you have a threat to a religious order as well as a political order and an economic order. And lastly, what do I say to the Haitian diaspora? I'm so glad that you all have mentioned this, component of diaspora. We don't have to hate ourselves. And you don't have to be a Vodouisan to respect that this is the tradition that allowed our ancestors to persevere, to recognize that this Congress of Bwa Kayiman, or this ceremony of Bwa Kayiman, which was most likely a both and, right? Because as Tracy Huck says, these multiple religious allegiances are ancient in the Americas and also on the African continent. You do not have to be a Vodouisan to recognize that this is what allowed our ancestors to persevere and to gain our liberation and independence. And let me tell y'all, the spirits will be here long after we're gone. So whether you choose to worship them or not is your own matter. But we have to recognize that this is part of our heritage. This is our legacy. And this is a gift that Haitians can give the world in terms of Vodou lessons. Aye, bobo.
Aye, bobo.
You just dropped the mic right there.
My
God. Clattering of mics that just took place.
Right. I mean, how, I know, so I don't know if people know what Dr. Daniels was talking about, the Zuzus or the Mez, but, these are, as she said, she described them perfectly. These were things we were doing in Corona. And everyone was like, should we be getting in on this mess? Should we be getting on this Zuzu? But we were like, oh, something's happening, and we got to get back to what we know works. And I really hope that that is something we can take away from these just out of this world scholars from my beloved nation, my matants here, as they are. I
am not that old.
Okay, my cousins, my
cousine, okay,
my cousine, okay. So, listen, but I'm following in my big cousin's footsteps, and I am just so thankful for them, and I hope that we can take away that our ancestors knew, and that we can go to things that work. That is something that is so common in Dr. Cruz's classes, that people may leave the Pentecostal church even, yet when they need something, when they need that prayer, when they need that breakthrough, they go right back to speaking in tongues, right? And so these are the traditions, of our ancestors. And I hope that those that go back to speaking in tongues, shouting or praying all night can also find ways to at least honor, right? To at least give up the hate, to at least give up the fear of the traditions that have inspired even our Black Christian faith. And so I just thank you all for being here. Dr. Daniels, Dr. Pierre, Dr. Duje Prosper, I thank you so, so much for the knowledge that you have shared with us. Dr. Cruz, my love for you. And I just thank you for facilitating this conversation and supporting us
I'm hoping that this is just part one of this
Exactly.
conversation, and that when we're able to be together in person after this hell of COVID, we could do a second part at Union Theological Seminary.
Absolutely. We see so many people.
I want to thank you all so much for this fantastic and fertile conversation.
Yes, and Dr. Cruz, there's so many people in the chat asking, well, you know, Dr. Duje Prosper said, take our class. So how do we take a class? So we might have to arrange a summer course or something with the three of you. You know, we'll talk to the higher ups at Union. But you know, Dr. Cruz has all the pool. Oops, did I say that on Union recording? But also thank you to our students. I said Dr. Bridget Webster, soon to be Dr. But Bridget Webster, Joshua Campbell, Minister Hayes McClendon, for being in our chat and connecting us with our audience. And so to the audience, thank you. Thank you. Once again, our Joshua and Hayes will post in the chat the links to give. I know I'm sounding real prosperity gospel, but if I sound annoying right now, I get texts and calls every single day from the people of Jeremy who are waiting for our support. And we trust them, we believe in them. We're beyond trusting in nonprofits and NGOs because we have seen so much theft even in that way. So please support us. $20 a person could go a long way in Jeremy and in Port-au-Prince. Also, I would like to let you know that our co-sponsor, In Cultured Company, is hosting a workshop on November 13th. Most specifically for Dominicans and Haitians to engage in peace building, but there are limited tickets for allies, for non-Dominican or Haitians. This workshop will take place in Manhattan. We ask if you would like to register ASAP, because believe it or not, we'll be halfway into November on November 13th in just a few days. And lastly, as I said, it is Fèt Gede. Honor your ancestors, put out their picture, light a candle, think of them, go to their grave and clean, plant flowers, whatever it might be. Even on Thanksgiving Day, even on Indigenous Peoples Day, and in this Indigenous Peoples Month, we ask that you would honor the land. We ask that you would honor those who tilt the land, and we would ask that you honor those who prayed over this land and danced on this land and poured libations into this land with intention. And so also, if you would like to celebrate with us, there will be a link in the chat for Fèt Gede that is being hosted by Riva, and there's limited tickets, but there's going to be a Gede ball, or bal, I should say, and so please, maybe if you're comfortable, come join us in person at the bal. And so we just thank you all for being here. I'm sorry that we went over time, but I hope that you have been enriched by this conversation. Thank you, and we will see you soon. Ayi bobo.